Hello everyone and welcome to this new edition of Euroquestions, the bi-monthly webinar of the Jacques Delors Institute. Today we have the pleasure to welcome Dr. Andreas Eisl, Senior Researcher at the Jacques Delors Institute. While the European Union is still on the world's third largest manufacturing power, its industry is under immense pressure from China, the United States, and the fallout of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Over the course of the last years, the EU has scrambled to answer the increasing geoeconomic competition through a more active industrial policy. But the current approach creates risk for the future of the single market, as highlighted by the Letta Report, and does not provide enough funding to make Europe sufficiently competitive, as shown in the Draghi Report. So which kind of the industrial policy is needed at the European level to allow it to continue to play its role? How should an European industrial policy be founded, based on which governance should it be operated? I remind you that you can use the Q&A question at the bottom of your screen, and now I give the floor to you, Andreas.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us in such big numbers today. My name is Andreas Eisl. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Jacques Delors Institute. And today I have the pleasure to basically speak about the contents of a policy paper that I just published this week entitled for competitive EU industrial policy, common funding, governance and conditionalities in the EU single market. And to just give you a bit the background of this paper and how we are where we are today, I think it's very interesting to look a bit back 15, 20 years, when in the EU we had a quite different competition and industrial policy paradigm that is developing today. And so until the early 2010s, you could argue, and I think it's well exemplified still by the Monti report that was published back then, the idea in Europe was really that the best type of industrial policy that you can do is competition policy. It's basically working to construct competitive markets in the EU that will lead to innovation and that will subsequently lead to economic growth. And if you use industrial policy, it's really to just basically provide support for horizontal policy, such as research and education, and also a bit for regional industrial policy measures, basically in regarding cohesion. And so the idea of this competitive markets, the creation of a level playing field in the EU, was that it would not only then lead to internal competitiveness, that you create competitive firms internally, but then subsequently this would also lead to external competitiveness, so on the global sphere. And this really was thinking in the context of a more and more globalizing and also increasingly rules-based economic order that was in place. Next slide, please. In the last 15, 20 years, we really have seen some major changes across the globe in terms of geopolitical and geoeconomic context. And instead of this sort of rules-based globalization, we see an increasingly confrontative economic policy approach of other global powers, with an undermining of multilateral institutions and common rules. We know that the WTO now, for big parts, is actually defunct and is not working as it's supposed to work. And we also have seen in recent years huge subsidies handed out by China and also the US. In the US, it was this very emblematic Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, but in China is more broadly a policy strategy, basically. Next to this, we also experienced a series of crises that have in recent years really exposed the EU dependencies. On the one hand, in terms of energy, especially in relationship with the war of aggression of Russia in the Ukraine, but also in the COVID-19 crisis, and next to it also these broader supply chains dependencies that we have. Finally, also the urgency of the climate crisis has become more and more present, also in public discourse. And I think if we want to keep the planet livable for future generations, it actually now, as there was not more action taken before, really also need directed public and private action to do so. And something that has been shown in the Letta and Draghi reports, also something that is highlighted a lot by the ECB, is also in the last 20 years, Europe has really been a laggard in the digital revolution, either in terms of adoption of technologies or also having its own leadership in terms of companies there. And so the EU has scrambled in the last years to find some sort of response to these challenges, to these external challenges mainly. And in terms of subsidies and state aid, the Union has this done mainly through using different exemptions in the existing treaties, and has done different things, such as developed instruments as the important projects of common European interest, the IPCIs, made changes, flexibilizing, giving more room for maneuver for the rules contained in the general block exemption regulation, the CHIBA rules, created also a more elaborate green transition state aid framework, also in terms of renewable energies, the CEAG, and in response to the COVID crisis and energy price crisis, also flexibilized state aid rules through several temporary frameworks that are still at least partly in force, so most of them should run out by the end of 2025. And of course, beyond that, numerous other initiatives were taken in these policy areas of competition policy, industrial policy, and trade policy, such as the Foreign Subsidy Regulation, CBAM, the Quickly Raw Material Act, STEP, and others. But I will today really focus more on this question of financing and how it's to be done. And so far, basically, using these different instruments, the financing of the new industrial policy approach has been largely provided by member states. The Next Generation EU, and so the recovery plan and the national plans could provide also some additional money for industrial policy, at least for some industrial policy priorities. The EU budget was also a bit put towards this direction, but the biggest part, really the largest part so far, and likely also in the future, if nothing is changed, of this new industrial policy approach is financed by member states. And with this also comes the question of who selects policy priorities and the projects to be subsidized. And this is also something that is currently strongly concentrated in member states' hands. And in the end, all of this means that currently richer and larger member states that have bigger financial, administrative, and technical capacities, they have, in fact, made more use of these available state aid instruments, and especially also of those that have stronger cross-country implications inside the single market. And so this really raises the question for a need for a more European industrial policy, because this current approach really creates risks of unfair competition and market fragmentation inside the single market. And I think still, especially today, the single market is really a public good for the EU and is really an asset for the European Union, also in this increasingly geopolitical confrontation. And so it's something that we should be careful not to undermine, basically, but rather to strengthen. And also this current industrial policy approach, I think, is not necessarily the most efficient one, and actually tends, at least partly, to foster conditions for what you call corporate welfare and state aid shopping. So companies basically going to different member states and looking for where they can get the best deal in a way, and so forth. And so in the current context, I think a more active industrial policy is definitely needed in Europe than we have had in the past, but it really has to be made more European to improve coordination and efficiency and really reduce also these tensions with competition policy. And that's really the argument that I'm making in the policy paper that I published this week, is that for a competitive EU industrial policy, we need three things, and they need to come together, I think, to work best, and that is common financing, common governance, and common conditionalities. And I will now detail a bit more these three aspects. So first, regarding common financing. So there have been a lot of talks in the last years, from a sovereignty fund to a competitiveness fund. There was the so-called STEP that was introduced in the midterm review of the MFF. But the whole question is, how can we finance basically a more ambitious, especially EU industrial policy? And it doesn't really matter what the name is. In the end, I think what is needed is more money, and we need certainty, a certain certainty that we can also basically can spend money on a common industrial policy for a given and this, at best, a long-term perspective, basically. In 2026, the RRF is running out. Now we will have huge negotiations on the next MFF starting in 2025, really, for the most part. But the question is if we're actually not running into a cliff at the end of the RRF and actually having less money in a situation where the Letta and the Draghi reports have shown, and also the Commission have shown, that we have huge investment needs, and also huge investment needs in terms of industrial policy. And so what I propose in this paper, and which can, of course, then be part in a future competitiveness fund, as it is now in the works at the Commission. But however you want to call it, I think we need to have additional funding, and for this additional funding, we have to have two revenue pillars. The first one is to have an initial endowment to allow for at least quite immediate action, because the fragmentation risks are real and are there. And there are different options, of course, to do this. My preferred option would be to do this through common debt, and maybe in a mix with new own resources. You can also, of course, reflect about how this is now done mainly in the discussions on the competitiveness fund, if it's just coming from the EU budget. But if there's no additional money and we're just rehashing again money that is in the budget, we are not really will have enough money to basically follow through on our policy priorities and our ambitions in Europe. And then in a more medium and long-term view, I think it would be very useful to have arrangements in place to make this fund at least partly self-sustaining in the longer term. Already in the Letta report, it was mentioned that we could put into place a so-called state aid contribution, which in the end would be basically member states that are running national subsidies, basically pay a small share of this in a common fund, so that with this, at least also other countries with maybe less fiscal space can also finance industrial policy projects. I think this should be conditional on the existence of EU funding for industrial policy as well. So this should not just be put into place if there is not really any EU funding. It should be, in a way, also a measure that incentivizes to going to the EU funding rather than just doing things alone, basically. And then I think what's also important is, and which should be really explored, is question of how, if the EU in this case, but also the member states, give money to enterprises, how, if these projects are very successful, because in this case, the EU and also the member states are risk takers, they can also profit from putting money in these projects. And so there are different ways of how we could do this, from royalties to becoming part of equity, a silent partnership, so-called. I detail it a bit more in the paper, but there are different options to do this, and I think it's something would be very worth to explore, basically also to be efficient in a certain way, and really also maybe be able better to identify the projects that really need help and other companies that maybe can do it by themselves, basically. The funds spending, so this EU Industrial Policy Fund, should be directed at state aid projects in line, of course, with EU interests, objectives and goals. I mean, we have a lot of objectives now at the table, from the green transition to digital policy, so forth, and even in terms of economic security. So there are different objectives in place, but I think the fund should be able to finance different projects in this regard, but it should be placed on common objectives. And one option also to, I think, try to find more fiscal space also, and to find more money and leverage a bit maybe EU funding with national funding, but without going just a national path. I think we could also explore really the design of this common fund spending, which could be used in a way of making use of an exemption that is present in the reformed EU fiscal framework, which basically allows the exemption of national co-financing of EU-funded programs from the fiscal rules. And so especially from countries that are maybe not constrained that much by just basically by the markets, but more by the fiscal rules, that you have some leeway there for more public investment, basically. But this would then still be projects that are also co-financed and supported at the EU level, and you would have a better control, basically, of which sort of projects these are than if it's just done at the national level alone. And coming with this common financing, I think it's crucial to develop a more common governance and more common capacities, basically. Before I made this list of different instruments that exist now in terms of state aid, I think these instruments need to be made simpler, more coherent, and become better integrated. The last years have really been a bit of scramble for responses, and so there is initiative after initiative was started. I think now is really a moment, also in view of the end of some of the temporary frameworks, to draw the lessons basically from all of these different exercises and think about which elements should be translated into a more permanent framework, and also how different instruments can work better together. I think an interesting example of how there was learning in the last years and how you can maybe try to improve specific processes and instruments is basically IPCIs, which fund highly innovative, global state-of-the-art value chain projects, basically from hydrogen over batteries through microelectronics. They had so many partners and countries included that the process has become very long. And in a way of trying to keep the system of these integrated projects, which I think is something very commendable, they tried to find ways of integrating partners without all of them having to go through a very encompassing and quite difficult bureaucratically process. And what they did in 2023 was basically amend the GBA rules, which makes it easier now basically to have some of these projects part of an IPCI ecosystem in a way to be funded through this, but then the rest through the IPCI. So I think that's interesting in terms of synergies that you can try to build to improve the functioning of different instruments. Also, the state aid application, implementation, and evaluation processes need to be harmonized and simplified across all government levels. I think, again, given the growth of these different instruments, they have a lot of them have been come about in a quite ad hoc manner, and so the processes can be quite different, and again, even between different member states, the processes can be quite different in terms of how enterprises are basically selected, how they have to apply, basically how this functions. And I think there's a big need, really, on the one hand, to simplify this and also to harmonize it so that there is a more equal access for companies across the EU to be able to do so. And in this regard, I think it's really important also to create and reinforce common capacities. On the one hand, to identify industrial policy projects and also to develop them. And there have been now some moves in this direction, which I think are interesting. For IPCIs, for example, there's the so-called Joint Economic Forum now that was put into place last year. But even more broadly, please still go back to the last slide, thank you. There is a need also to improve, and I think at the central level, support for companies, especially smaller companies, but also for member states to better understand how these processes work. Am I actually eligible for this and this sort of instrument, and basically how to support them to get the technical expertise to write the right documents, and also for the member states to be able to do these processes. And I think that's the most important point. I worked quite a lot on the IPCIs, and I'm quite fond of the instrument in its idea, which is that you think about industrial policy projects really in an integrated cross-European manner, and you think about the full value chain basically, and then you're trying to bring different actors together, different stakeholders to really develop also an ecosystem regarding this. And I think for the future, we should more broadly think about common governance mechanisms that can be different for different policy objectives and technology areas, but then should always be the same sort of governance in a certain logic, basically. And for this, I think the IPCI instrument can really serve as a model and should be developed further. The communication, basically the guidelines of the Commission of how to interpret the treaty article that provides the room for using basically these important projects of European common interest to develop state aid projects is quite narrow in a sense. And I think the treaty article gives more room actually if there's a political willingness to do so. And I think in the future we could think about enlarging basically the remit of this communication, and maybe also allow for other types of industrial policy projects that are maybe going beyond global state of the art or beyond basically first industrial deployment. Next slide, please. And a third point, I think, which is also important, especially if we want to ensure that the subsidies that we are providing at the European level and at the national level are actually achieving their objectives, and to, I think, at best avoid wasteful expenditures and maybe corporate welfare, is really a consistent, coherent and intelligent use of common conditionalities. And so again, depending on the policy objectives, which can be quite different in terms of competitiveness, green transition, economic security and so forth, nevertheless, inside these individual objectives, I think it's very important to try to apply a common set of conditionality requirements. For IPCIs, what is already done very well is basically applying, for example, the do no significant harm principle. But for the future, we could think basically enlarging this to other policy areas, basically, but also think about how we can have coherent use of, for example, labor standards to even avoid inside the EU that there's maybe sort of state aid dumping between different member states, and maybe also use more smartly content requirements, basically. What is very important for conditionalities is that they need to be measurable, monitorable, and also enforceable, and that there's not really a change in between what is initially announced, but then it's not followed through. And so I think that's something that is very important and should be really made clear when basically making these projects. And finally, I think some of different conditionalities can have some tensions between them, and also there could be some tension between different policy objectives. So I think it's really important to think about how to well design this, to smartly design this, to also create synergies between different conditionalities. But as the seminar is short, I leave it at that, and I open the floor for your questions and remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for your presentation. So we received a few questions. Maybe a first one, you mentioned it a bit in your presentation, but how can we link the potential European industrial policy to the implementation of the Green Deal?
So I think there's currently a huge debate on whether the Green Deal has been bad for competitiveness and whether there's a tension between the two. I'm part of the group of people who believes that I think the EU should continue to really develop industrial policy also in view of accelerating the green transition, and also to ensure that Europe, in some sectors where it is, remains leader of the green transition, also in terms of its industry, and at least in some others, try to stop the bleeding, basically, and remain it. We can probably not be the leader in all of the different areas, but I think there is still areas where there's a huge possibility, basically, to move forward. So for me, the industrial policy and this active industrial policy is part of these investment needs that are discussed to basically have an industry that is as quick as possible, also capable of being green, basically. But as I said, I mean, there are different policy objectives, and not all industrial policy objectives have been exclusively competition based and competitiveness based, basically, but some are really just also to allow us as quick as possible to move to a more greener economy, basically.
Thank you, Andreas. Maybe a second question. How can the EU still invest in an industrial policy when some of their member states, like France or Italy, have very high public debt?
I think the answer to this is really a more European approach, basically. I mean, we have seen that now in the last years, there has been a huge difference in the use of state aid. This has, in some countries that have actually a little fiscal space, been facilitated by the fact that fiscal rules were suspended, but now they're coming back into force. And so you have on the one hand market pressures that are, I think, have become more prominent again for some member states, but you also have the pressure coming from the implementation of the new fiscal rules. So from 2025 on, all member states, or so this autumn already, all member states have to present medium-term fiscal structural plans where they are basically laying out their fiscal consolidation. And so in this context of little spending space, I think moving EU industrial policy not only to reduce the tensions with the single market and competition policy is useful, but also to actually have the fiscal space across Europe to do so. There can be a link then, as I said, with maybe using some of the exemptions of the new fiscal framework to also crowd in some more national spending that would have maybe not been available otherwise. But I think it's really by having more EU funding that we can address this properly.
Thank you, Andreas. Another question: have you considered the issue of strengthening place-based industrial policy? How to ensure that all EU area and places can actually tap into their potential to make Europe more competitive as a whole? The very cross-border common public goods focus in the Draghi report might have some limits in terms of territorial cohesion.
I think that's an interesting point, a super interesting point, because it just highlights some of the tensions that are nevertheless there. So also in my presentation, I'm making the argument that a more EU-funded policy would be good, because it would also, I think, would be better at identifying the best projects across Europe, so the most efficient projects also in terms of use of money and the output, basically. The big question related to this, so on the one hand, this is good because it would mean we have an efficient use of money, and we're not selecting based just on the size of the fiscal purse of a specific member state. But in some technologies still, especially the richer and more advanced member states, have already at least a technological base there, so it's often easier then to further develop technology in place in these regions, which would then, of course, still create the problem that we have a strong differences between regions that then would profit strongly, but that were maybe already before economically strong, and some regions that are left behind. And there, I think it's really useful to think about what broader regional comparative advantages specific areas have that go beyond just the existence of maybe companies that are already there, but also in terms of where you can produce cheaply renewable energy, for example, where basically there is labor available that has the response to the good skills, basically. But I still think then you can address this to a certain extent, but then there's still a question. I think that's what cohesion policy at least traditionally tried to do, is still a question of how you more broadly deal with this. So I think it cannot be completely addressed. I think there are ways of addressing it better than it's currently done right now. But I think still needs to a reflection of how to deal with regions that are underperforming economically and that are maybe in a risk of a middle income trap or a low income trap and are not really able of coming out of that.
Thanks, Andreas. And maybe one last question. What can we expect from the next MFF in terms of new industrial instruments without additional resources at the EU level?
Yeah, so I mean, there were some leaks now about changes to the MFF. I think that the Commission is thinking about, which are very radical in a way if you compare it to the past. I mean, the Competitiveness Fund would basically put together some existing funding in the budget, but that would then especially used for particular uses that would also correspond quite a bit to industrial policy, and then there would be another big money pot basically. And there would also be major changes in terms of how to get money basically in exchange for investments and reforms that are a bit similar or a lot similar basically to what was done with the RRF. And also I think a move towards performance budgeting. If we are moving to a new EU budget without any additional money basically, I think we really just don't have sufficient money to follow through on our ambitions. And even if there's more flexibility in the funds and it's maybe more easy now to put it on specific policy priorities, in other areas, I think we'll just, we are basically losing money, and that could touch very well maybe the question of cohesion in Europe, basically, of how to support also through the EU budget specific regions that are left behind to a certain extent. And there's also the repayment of the debt from NGU, which is also basically coming to play if we are not agreeing on any new own resources. I mean, they have been discussed about now for quite a while. But there's still very little movement on this question. So I think there is a positive tendency of trying to simplify and to make, and I think there's a lot of technical questions of how to make access to funds easier. And I think it's useful to try to make the EU budget a bit more flexible, but you also need to be careful then not to overhaul too strongly some of the things I think in the past that have been financed through the EU budget and that have worked quite well. And it's also important to keep, even if you want to have more flexibility, also some sort of predictability in the EU budget. And in terms of industrial policy, that's important. One of the reasons companies are very fond of the IRA in the US is because in principle, it's guaranteed for a 10-year period, basically. And so you're pretty well know basically with which policy environment you're living. Of course, there can in democracies be changes, but if we are now completely flexibilizing the MFF, then there is the problem in the other direction that maybe, okay, it's good, we can more easily finance particular priorities, but in terms of predictability, this is quite a big problem for specific sectors. And I think this is something one needs to be careful about. And so there can be a lot of different ways of how you construct now a more unified fund, basically, and then you still have basically fixed compartments for specific policy priorities, but all running basically through same sort of procedures. But I think it's important to keep this predictability in the new MFF. And I think it's key really to find additional resources for this more active industrial policy. The needs are really gigantic, basically. And so I think just by simply reforming the FMF without any new money will be insufficient, basically, for a really ambitious EU industrial policy where we can achieve our policy objectives.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for all your analysis. I remind everyone that your publication is available on the Jacques Delors Institute website in English and soon in French. So thank you for following today Euroquestion. The replay will be sent over to you later today. The next session will be held on Wednesday, 21st October, and we will have the pleasure to welcome Natalie Tocci, Director of the Institut of Affari Internazionali and member of our Board of Directors. She will analyze the effect and implication of Giorgia Meloni's at the EU level 2 years after her election. And thank you very much again. Thanks, Andreas, and see you next time.
Thank you. Bye.